Joining me now is former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. There's so much to discuss here, and I think so many people are trying to really understand it. Let me just start with this gag order. Do you think, looking at this, Judge Chutkan reinstated the gag order after she put a pause on it? It's still under appeal. Are you confident, or do you feel comfortable with her legal justification for reinstating it?
Yeah, I certainly think there's a basis for her concern. I think there's a basis for the order that she has, in fact, put in place. My expectation would be that the appellate court will, in fact, uphold that which she has tried to restrain the former president from doing. It's a pretty limited order. It does not say that you can't say anything. It says you can't say negative things about a relatively small universe of people. You can even comment on the case. But I think, as you said in the lead-in, I think he's likely to go beyond that which even she says in that limited order. And we're going to have some ultimate questions that I think are going to have to be determined. Would a judge actually do that which would happen to a normal person and put somebody in jail for violating an order, not to a gag order? I suspect that's not likely to happen with this defendant, but any other defendant would probably be facing...
You don't think that she would put him in jail, or that they would decide to put him in jail ultimately?
I just don't think so. I mean, I think there are a number of things. You put monetary fines on him, as the judge did in New York, perhaps restrict his ability to use Truth Social. A number of things. I try to be as creative as possible if I were the judge, but I'd be extremely reluctant to take a person who's a former president, the leading candidate of one of our major parties, and actually put him in jail.
Because you'd be worried about the political consequences or the reaction in the country?
Yeah, I mean, this is already a pretty divided nation, and to do something like that, to take somebody off the campaign trail, to put him in jail, I just would be very reluctant, really reluctant to do that.
Now, it seems like Trump's lawyers are going to continue to appeal this. Would this ultimately, the gag order, could this ultimately end up at the Supreme Court, a decision about whether or not a gag order against a former president is legal?
It conceivably could. I mean, this is a federal case. The Supreme Court has ultimate jurisdiction over all, federal matters. So it's possible that this gag order could go before the Supreme Court. I would think, again, though, that this is not the kind of thing that typically ends up before the Supreme Court, and I would think that it would you'd probably resolve it at the appellate court level, at in front of the D.C. Circuit. So
what are the other options this judge has? This is kind of what everybody's wondering. None of these fines are working. Trump is not... he's continuing to attack people. We all expect him to continue to. If she's not going to put him in jail, or she shouldn't, what can they do?
Well, I'd maybe increase the level of fines. I think the judge in New York started at maybe $5,000.
Yeah.
It went, I think, to $25,000. Maybe you start imposing fines that even for a person who claims to be a billionaire will have, some kind of impact. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of the fines that might be levied.
There is we also learned today of an Alabama man, I mentioned this as well, who was indicted for threatening Fulton County District Attorney and a sheriff regarding Trump's Georgia election case. I'm wondering, I mean, you have watched hate speech, you've watched the impact of Trump's rhetoric. What is the connection? Do you see a connection there between the allowance of these type of threats, what Trump is doing out there publicly, and these type of threats against people like Fani Willis?
Yeah, I think these comments by the former president have to be viewed as attacks in two ways. One, on the system itself, and that has to be dealt with. But it also creates an environment in which the kinds of things you've just described, where threats are made against people involved in the case, are taken seriously by malcontents, nutcases, lone wolves, who might act upon the very things that he says. And so the concern that I have is not only for the system, but for the participants who are actually going to be attacked by the former president. And that threat is real. I mean, with all the guns that we have out there, in the environment that we now have, I'm sure that there's adequate security for all of the people who are involved in these cases. But the fact is that security is actually needed. And that is a sad thing to say. Involving a legal matter, involving a former president, it means that you've got to have protection for the people who are simply trying to uphold the law and do the jobs that they were elected to do.
It's quite a time. I mean, I think we talk a lot about how immoral, how dangerous all of these threats are that Donald Trump is making. Talk us through why this is such a problem in attacking potential witnesses in a case. I mean, if you were a prosecutor, if you were a judge, beyond obviously the violence, which is very important, what else are you worried about?
Sure, you're worried about whether or not a witness is going to be intimidated and be reluctant to share incriminating information against the former president out of fear that one of his followers is going to do something physical to that witness. You know, in mob cases, you know, one of which I tried when I was a public corruption prosecutor, we relocated people, we put people in the witness protection program. We did a whole variety of things to allay the fears that people have when they feel threatened. And that is not fundamentally different from, I think, some of the concerns that witnesses potentially could have in this case, or these cases.
There's also a case today in Colorado, I mentioned this, where it's questioning whether turning the 14th Amendment could be used essentially to kick Trump off the ballot. It's not the only state where there's a case like this. What do you make of that legal argument?
Yeah, I think there are some legal questions there as to whether or not, it applies to a president. This question we've looked at the word of and how it's used, the word the and how it is used there. And then I also worry about, taking him away from the ability to run for president, taking him off the ballot without the people of the United States, taking a choice away from the people of the United States. And in the same way that I would be reluctant, if I were a judge, to put him in jail, I'm also reluctant to use this provision of the Constitution to take him out of the election. I think we should, let's have this election, let's have it a fair election, let's have it well run, and let the people decide. I'm actually pretty confident that. I can actually guarantee that he will not win the popular vote. That'll guarantee. The question is whether or not he will win in the Electoral College, and that I think is going to be a lot closer. And I'm concerned about what the result would be there. But at the end of the day, I think that is the place to decide whether or not he should be the next president of the United States.
As we all follow this, because there's different state cases, and I just was trying to understand what the impact could be. If a judge in Colorado, say, rules he should be kicked off, but a judge in Minnesota rules he shouldn't be, then that's conflicting, right? And that could go to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, that would ultimately go to the Supreme Court. I mean, the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of what the Constitution says. And if you had conflicting rulings by judges in different states, I think that ultimately would have to be decided by the United States Supreme Court.
I know you probably don't find yourself agreeing with Bill Barr often, I suspect, but we did just listen to kind of what he had to say. And I'm wondering what you make of his comments about Trump's pledges for retribution and the chaos that could cause. I mean, what scares you most about what he could do if he were in a position of naming a new attorney general, overseeing a Department of Justice?
Yeah, I think that Attorney General Barr actually has it right there. And this is one of the few instances where I would agree with him, though I would ask him, you knew this about this guy before you decided to be his attorney general. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm obviously concerned about what he can do between now and the election. And were he to win the election, I'm really concerned about what he would do to the rule of law, to our system of justice, to the United States Department of Justice that is, near and dear to me. There is nothing that I would put beyond what Donald Trump would do in order to save himself, in order to ensure that his interests are protected and those who are his supporters are protected. And you would, in essence, I think the former Attorney General is also right. You would be getting not the second team, not the third team. You'd be getting the fourth team in a new Trump administration. And so as bad as things might have been, 4 years or so ago before, I suspect they would be even worse. After starting in 2025.